Good evening and welcome to the show. We are so glad to have you with us. We have an exciting program for you this entire hour. We're going to be talking about taxes. And we've got an expert here with us. We've got Nick Xanthopoulos, and he will explain what he can do for us. And we're going to be talking about things in all 4 sessions. We're going to be talking about how most people end up owing the IRS. Now, Nick is going to repeat a lot of the things I'm saying. And then we're going to go into session 2, and we'll be talking about how the IRS can file or audit a person's tax return. We'll explain what 3 and 4 are going to be later. But I want you to make sure you have pen and paper, take a lot of notes, make sure you write down his number, because if you have any questions after the show is over, we definitely want you to make sure that you call him, stay in touch with his office, and get all the answers to your questions. At this time, I'd just like to welcome Nick to the program. Nick, welcome to the program. Welcome to Pahrump.
Thank you for having me here.
Hey, we love having you here because we want to talk about taxes. I know it's on everybody's mind, and income taxes is such an important thing. I know you all agree with that. And Nick, like I said, he's got so much information for us. So as long as you've got something to write down the numbers. You see what office he's from on the screen right now, and just be prepared for everything. And that way you have your questions lined up so that when you do call his office, you can ask him those questions. Nick, what do you want to tell us first?
Well, the first part is, and there are 2 categories here, but how people end up owing the IRS.
Okay.
And the first one is the usual process. It's what most people are familiar with. It's March, and you're sitting down either by yourself or with your spouse, and you're getting ready to file your tax return by the April 15th deadline. And that's usually where it all starts for most people.
Okay. Now, we know IRS is open all year round.
That's right.
But we also know that April is coming, and we need to be prepared for that, which is why we're preparing this show.
That's right. And April 15th is a deadline for filing the tax return, but people should be thinking about it well before then.
Absolutely.
At the start of the year, in the middle of the year, and when their life circumstances change as well.
Okay.
So what happens most of the time is people have Form 1040, the U.S. individual income tax return. They are listing their income, they're listing their deductions, their credits, and it ends up with the line saying amount you owe, and then they file it. And that's called self-assessment.
Okay.
It's an honor system basically saying, hey, IRS, here's my taxes, here's what I've paid, here's still what I owe.
Or I want some back for a refund.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
And whether it's a refund or an amount due, timing is critical.
Okay.
So you always want to file by the April 15th deadline, whether you owe the IRS or they owe you. So for most people, there are 2 different circumstances under which they end up owing the IRS when it comes tax season and they have an amount due on their tax return.
Okay.
So the first one is for people who are employees. They get a W-2. Those who get Social Security as well as other income. Those who are getting pensions or annuities. And the way that works is that the amount withheld for each pay period, amount of taxes withheld, isn't enough to cover all of what they owe.
Okay.
And the credits they're entitled to, if any, don't eliminate the remaining taxes.
Gotcha. Okay.
The other category of folk that's most common that we see are those who are self-employed. And
Yes.
that includes people that get a Form 1099-MISC, short for miscellaneous.
Okay.
And it reports non-employee compensation, which is a form of self-employment. And for people in that situation, they usually end up owing if they haven't made sufficient estimated quarterly tax payments throughout the year.
Very good. Okay.
And that's why it's a topic that should be on people's minds at all times during the year, not just when they're ready to file.
So when you make that quarterly estimate that you would make just to make sure you've paid enough taxes, you need to make sure that you're paying enough so that you don't owe something at the end of the year.
Exactly. That's right. So what we'll start talking about first are people who need to withhold enough income taxes.
Okay.
And so there are actually a few different kinds of forms for that. And this is in a handout that we should have on our website, and I'll be listing that after the show. So the first step is for people in that situation to make sure they complete an accurate withholding request.
Okay.
And if you're an employee, it's called a W-4. And that's the form that you usually fill out when you start a job.
Yes.
And it's got the worksheet, and at the bottom you have the certificate you give to your employer.
Right.
If you are receiving pensions or you're receiving an annuity, it's a somewhat different form. That's the W-4P for pension.
Okay.
And that's something also that should be filled out accurately so that the payor, the company, the pension company, is withholding enough to send to the IRS,
Okay.
so you don't end up owing a big chunk come April 15th.
And you really don't want to do that.
No.
Now I want to ask you one other question. It's a question that has probably nothing to do with your presentation, but I know with your expertise you can answer it. A lot of people in Pahrump and elsewhere have heard commercials that say if you owe thousands of dollars to the government, you don't have to pay the full amount.
I'm glad you bring that up because unfortunately, I don't know why it is, but when it comes to IRS taxes, there are huge numbers of myths. There are
Yes.
also, unfortunately, a lot of fraudsters, impersonators pretending they're with the IRS. So whenever someone tells you, hey, the IRS tax law is this, or when preparing your tax return that, you should be thinking, what are your qualifications? Are you an attorney? Are you a CPA? Are you an enrolled agent?
Okay.
Because anybody can say anything pretty much. Doesn't mean they're qualified to.
Okay.
And so, yeah, it's always that to keep in mind, as well as if it's a company, it can sometimes be buyer beware.
Okay. So if I owe $10,000 to the IRS, I'm probably going to have to pay $10,000.
Not necessarily, though.
Okay.
There are some programs, and later on we'll talk about that in
Okay.
some more detail.
Okay. We always run out of time, and I want to give Nick as much time as I can to explain this first part for the first session. So go ahead.
So the third kind of withholding request is W-4V, as in voluntary. And that's for people who receive Social Security income, which might be taxable, it might not, it depends on some factors. It's also for unemployment compensation, which is taxable, and for a few other kinds of income. So that's the first step, is making sure that you request an accurate amount to be withheld when you start getting the income.
Okay.
The next equally crucial part, though, is when life circumstances change, you should update those forms by filling out a new one and providing it to the payor, whether your employer or the pension plan. Examples would be you get married, you get divorced, you can claim another dependent, you can no longer claim a dependent, or you start or stop a second job. Mm-hmm. It does get kind of complex, but fortunately there is a withholding calculator on the Internal Revenue Service website, which has tons of great material. So irs.gov is a great place to go to read about and learn more about taxes.
Now we have quite a few people in our audience that are listening that may not have access to internet. Now they can go to the library and have access, or they can call you.
Yeah, if someone doesn't have their own access to the internet, but can go to a library, I think that's a great option.
Okay.
If they don't, their best bet is to go through the instructions on each of these withholding request forms, as well as publication 505, which they may be able to call the IRS and request a copy of. But the reason the website version is so great is that it just asks the questions that are really critical, and it does the computations for you.
Okay.
Versus the worksheet where it's handwritten, you have to write this stuff down, you got to put it down, take another look to make sure it's right. So it's a great, great tool.
Okay.
So that basically covers people who are not self-employed and making sure that they are paying the IRS enough during the year. Because think of it this way, how straightforward would the process be if you paid your mortgage or your rent or your car payment all at once instead of each month?
Yeah.
So budgetarily, it's just a lot easier for people to deal with, I think, if they're making payments as it goes in affordable sizes instead of a big chunk all at once.
Absolutely. Okay.
So back to those who are self-employed, for a lot of folk in that situation, they have to make what's called estimated tax payments, and that's quarterly. So there's, because 12 divided by, so every few months they got to do that, and that has its own deadlines. And so that's kind of a two-part test. A person needs to make estimated payments if the total taxes they'll owe is $1,000 or more.
Okay.
And if there's any kind of withholdings, if that and refundable credits aren't at least 90% of the taxes that you owe.
Okay.
Because essentially it's to avoid a penalty. And the IRS has a bunch of different kinds of those. So by doing this, you are minimizing what you owe.
Okay. I like the way you say IRS has a lot of different ways of doing so many different things. But I think you've explained how most people end up owing the IRS. And that's what we wanted to cover in this first session, to make sure that was covered. I hope you've taken enough notes and written down enough numbers so that you know where to go, how to get it done. And I know we have a lot to cover in sessions 2, 3, and 4. So there's so much more. And we want you to make sure that you stay with us. Listen to what Nick is saying. Follow his advice. He is an attorney, and he knows what he's talking about. So we want you to be prepared when you come back in the next session. Have your paper and your pencil and pen available so you can make sure you don't miss any of this very important information. And Nick, I want you to stay by because we're going to go into more information for session 2. And we want you to be sure to be with us.
Thank you, Tom.